Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Open Forum for 2021. Obviously, we'd hoped that by now we might be able to meet in person, at least some of us, but the decision on that is clearly at least a week away, and the implementation of it at least 2 weeks away, and if you, depending on which paper you read this morning, may well be further than that. Nevertheless, I think we're all very familiar with these sorts of events being online, and they still can add tremendous value to business. And certainly what we are trying to do with Open Forum today is ensure that there is adequate time both for questions and for networking. Now, if we look at the agenda we're going to run through today, so next slide, please. I'm going to give a brief overview of where the automotive sector is right now as of June. I'm sure you're all experiencing ongoing challenges. We'll touch on some of them, but hopefully the future is going to get easier, even if it's still in that tunnel and the light is still some way off in the tunnel when we think about some of the challenges we're all facing. Speaking of those challenges, we'll then be joined by Dan Jack, the Global Sales and Commercial Director of Trifast, to explain how they're managing some of those challenges and some of those opportunities. And then a focus on manufacturing and the way forward from DHL Supply Chain. Delighted that Goodrick will be with us. Then we're going to move on to the future and the technological shift that's taking place and about transitioning to electric vehicles, some of the challenges and indeed opportunities there for supply chain, and with Dom Tribe from Vendigital, and then finally with one of the issues that SMMT has been working with a number of partners with, and my colleague from Stellantis, Mick Aiers, one of the drivers behind that, about our Safe Harbour update, creating that environment which will enable you to have discussions which normally in terms of commercial confidentiality are not allowed, but to have, within that safe harbor, how you can use that framework to manage business expectations with your partners. Now, as I said from the outset, we do want this to be as interactive as it can be, given that this is virtual, and so we will have a panel discussion and Q&A at the end. So I would invite you to enter your questions as we go in the chat box, the question box, which is located below on the video stream on the microsite, and thereafter to join the Remo platform, where we'll have some structured networking. Some of you have been familiar with these activities. We've done these before and they work very well. It's a good platform and it's a fairly intuitive one, which, unlike many of these solutions to the problems that we face with remote working, but I would thoroughly encourage you to join, and we'll try and ensure that there is as much networking as possible within those constraints. Okay, so let's move on to where we are in terms of the latest situation of the automotive industry. And if we go to the next slide, please, James. Let's look first at the new car market. How would one describe it? Don't believe everything you read, I think. We put out the new car registrations for May. They're up 674%. But of course, you're comparing it with May last year, which was a very, very difficult month because showrooms were shut. In the same way, April was up some 30-fold on the previous month. And and as I expect, when you think back of last year, the early times of the pandemic, showrooms were shut. Yes, you were allowed to do online deliveries, but what was being, I think, remarkable over the course of the last 12 months is the way so many businesses from both the manufacturer and the dealer side have been very good at shifting to online sales. The fact that, over the course of the year, which included about 4.5 to 5 months worth of showroom closures, we ended up only about 30% down on the previous year, was testament to the adaptability of the industry in moving to some of these different approaches. Thankfully, showrooms are now open again. They have been open since April the 12th, certainly in England and gradually in the other countries as well. May was the first month where we had full sales on sales. Yeah, so it was up significantly, but a note of caution in that if you compare this last month, May, with both 2019, the last proper month, if you will, and indeed the 10-year average, it was still down from where it should be. This is partly because obviously when private consumers go into a showroom, place the order, it is a while before that product is delivered, and then that has perhaps potentially been exacerbated by some production issues I'll come to. But also, I think what we have done, we don't operate in isolation. Part of the overall sales go into business and fleet. They've generally supported the industry over the last 12 months more than a lot of the growth, any growth particular segments has been coming from them rather than private retail. Then you think, well, the travel industry's still not operating, as we know all too well, probably getting worse with Portugal closing as of today. That means the daily rental market equally isn't going to be purchasing vehicles because they just don't know when it is they're going to be returning to normality. So it does also depend on the state of the wider economy. The upside is obviously the increasing share of electric vehicles. May was about 8.5%, which is which was actually down on last year, but it was a very, as you would expect when you have such small sales. There was some variances on a month-by-month basis last year, but you are seeing the shift towards plug-in vehicles. The other big positive of the last month, not shown there, is van registrations. Still considering to accelerating much higher than normal, again, because of this dependence on online deliveries and also potentially some recover in the construction sector. So not all doom and gloom, but you look at those figures and 674% kind of belies what the underlying level of demand is, which is why we've called it a cautious recovery. Let's move on to the next slide. Manufacturing, still having a very, very difficult time. We don't have the May figures yet, but for the April figures, you can see that they were much stronger than last April, because last April, effectively, manufacturing was shut. I think we produced about 1,100 vehicles or something last April. So obviously up significantly, 34,573%, no less. But again, below where we want to be, below where we should be. Number of factors behind it. Yes, in terms of what levels of global demand, we're given some markets are still in lockdown, but also some of the other issues that are pressing on manufacturing. The most obvious one is the shortage of semiconductors, which is causing huge challenges to the industry, because mostly to do with the uncertainty. You can't forecast exactly when you're going to get your supply. I think globally, the automotive industry takes about 15% of global semiconductor output, which is a good indication of the technology that's in vehicles. But of course, we're a long way behind consumer electronics, who obviously take the lion's share. And obviously, if you are taking the lion's share, you have the greater call on those suppliers. So it is a very, very difficult situation for many manufacturers at the moment, and the inability to forecast exactly how it's going to play out makes it doubly difficult. On top of that, there are other issues: ships getting stuck in the Suez Canal, storms in Texas, I think it was earlier in the year, fires in some particular parts of Japan, so supplier in Japan. All of these combined to make a very difficult first quarter and second quarter. And I think the outlook for the year is still pretty tough because of that unpredictability. Overlaying all of that is, of course, where we are in terms of Brexit. We are having to deal with additional friction at the border. While it is nominally a free trade agreement, there are still non-tariff barriers. There are still potential tariffs applicable, depending on what you're doing and where you're exporting to compared to what we did have. And the level of complexity, which is unfortunately the new normal, is putting additional pressure on both margins and the ability and ease with which we trade. That, as I said, is Brexit. we're trying to make things as simple as possible, and government has ambitions in that. But it does want to move to more IT-based trading system, but that'll be more like 4 or 5 years away rather than 4 or 5 months. What we do know is that the full implementation of UK controls, which are suspended for now, comes into effect at the end of the year. We need to use that time as efficiently as possible, both in terms of making sure we're ready, but also our partners across Europe who will be exporting into the UK, which will subsequently face those full controls. So it is, the clarion call is still to be as prepared as we can be. Can I go on to the next slide, please, James? What are our key priorities? Obviously, it is about competitiveness and the plan for growth. The government doesn't have an industrial strategy anymore, even though it's still the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. It's distancing itself from that. But what we did have published from Treasury was the Build Back Better plan for growth. Within that, it talks about various recovery plans, and within that, the automotive sector. That is something that we really need to push, because when I say our priorities are about recovery, the automotive priorities generally align with government priorities. If you're thinking about recovery, you're thinking about leveling up. Obviously, a lot of manufacturing takes place in those areas that the government wants to focus its attention. We talk about global Britain. This industry is export-led. 80% of what we produce goes abroad to a number of different countries. So the importance of automotive within trade policy remains a priority, both for the SMMT and the industry. We do want to ensure there are good, free and fair deals with different countries around the world, but they must reflect UK interests as well as international interests, and automotive should be at the heart of that, given we remain the largest sector in terms of goods exported. And the third thing, if you talk about government priorities, about recovery, leveling up, global Britain, and it's obviously about net zero. And net zero does depend on the mobility industry in its broadest sense, be they road transport, aviation, maritime, being net zero. And the challenge before the automotive sector is immense, given the pace that is expected if we were to meet the deadlines that are being set, which is obviously 2030/2035 for passenger cars and vans, 2040 for HGVs. So our priorities do align with government priorities, but we need to make sure that there was a strategy in place that helps us deliver it, because it's not all in the gift of the industry. Next slide. We'll be talking about some of these issues at our forthcoming International Automotive Summit, which is on the 29th of June. Still can't tell you whether it's going to be a hybrid event or an online event. Hopefully it's at least hybrid. A good lineup of speakers, as you can see there. If you haven't registered, please do so. And another quick advert, if you go on to the next slide, in terms of the next event on Tuesday, the 19th of October. Please, by then, we'll be able to do face-to-face activities. We're holding a Meet the Buyer in person at the Ricoh Arena in Coventry, targeting EV sourcing, with matchmaking, purchasing with potential suppliers. We'll provide some more information shortly, but it will build on what we ran a week or two ago, which was an online Meet the Buyer, which, given it was online, I think was very successful. And you can look at some of the figures there in terms of what we're able to achieve. It does deliver business opportunities, and we hope to both build on that and expand on that with the actual event in Coventry in November. So another date for your diary. Okay. I will stop there. I said any questions, put them in the question box, and we'll come to them at the end. What I'd like to do now is hand over to Dan Jack, who is the Global Sales and Commercial Director for Trifast. Been in the industry over 25 years, with extensive experience of both commercial, supply chain management, engineering, sales and marketing, and so forth, not just within the UK, but internationally as well. And I think a good company and a good individual to talk to us about some of the challenges and how they're overcoming them in 2021. So Dan, let me hand over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Morning, everybody, and appreciate that introduction too. Let's move on to the next slide, James, because I can give you a little bit of a taste of TR. Mike kindly said we're a good company, but let me explain what that looks like. We have been incorporated for nearly 50 years, so we'll reach that milestone in 2023. We're a fastener business. We're a C-class components business. We've got 32 global locations. I won't read each stat for you, but we are an engineering biased know-how organization. Very proud of the team that we have. We manufacture in 7 locations. We have a place here in the UK, 1 in Italy, and 5 in Asia. We have 3 engineering centers because we believe at the heart of good fastener supply is good design. And those centers are in the UK, in Sweden, and in the USA. We produce a lot of parts, 8 billion pieces a year, and we sell even more than that. We're very familiar with the automotive marketplace. It's roughly 1/3 of our business when we take commercial vehicle and light vehicle and bolt them together. But we also play in the electronics, the medical, the domestic appliance arenas as well. And that gives us the ability to not only just leverage volume, but also just to compare how things are held together. It's a niche industry, but hopefully you'll see it's an important one. And James, as you take us to the next slide, I think what you'll also see is that the challenges are very familiar. Mike articulated pace of recovery in Brexit. To us at a global level, we have seen a very strong recovery, pre-COVID volumes, but by geography that looks different. Sometimes it's staccato. Mike talked about the microchip challenges, and I'll mention those again in a moment. And Brexit is a very abrasive reality to our world since January. For us in the fastening industry, honestly, it felt a little bit more like a no deal than a deal. And in turn, we've had to respond to that. Labour shortages for us, because we are a broad global business, are up and down. And if I give you an example of today's circumstances, the semiconductor microchip industry is housed, amongst other places, in Taiwan, and there is a great dependency on that marketplace, as Mike described. What you're probably less likely to know is that around about $5 billion of fasteners are also made and exported out of Taiwan every year. In fact, I'd say there's not a single vehicle on the road in the UK that doesn't have a Taiwanese-made fastener in it, or several, to be honest with you. We have 2 factories there, which we're very proud of, but the challenges in the labour market, with the semiconductor microchip labour rate being much higher than that of the fastener manufacturing, and the lockdown and the border controls, which would normally allow a flow of people, those things have certainly got in our way. Unexpected circumstances, in hindsight and on reflection, of course, much of what's on this page, which I suspect most of us are feeling the pain on, much of what is on this page is not a surprise. But there have been those other surprises too. And Mike had a picture of a canal that's blocked, or a steel mill that's exploded, or a drought that's taking place. All of these things come together right now or over the last few months. And in our industry of fasteners, which is integral to the automotive manufacturing place, it has real consequence. Some consequences are material shortages. We've certainly seen a vast extension of lead times and quotas out of steel mills. And on top of that too, as we know, there are freight challenges, and those challenges range from availability of containers in the right place at the right time to the actual cost of moving those things around the world, which has gone, in some cases, exponentially. And then the air freight industry, as a consequence to that, are also impacted as well. What that means for us is our input costs have risen. What it requires us to do is have mature, pragmatic conversations with our customers across sectors to talk about how we might share this short-term pain. Now, I say short-term, by the way, because I don't believe, and I think Mike said it too, that we are yet in this eye of the storm. A lot of what we see on this page is still in front of us. If there was a graph, we're on the left-hand side of a bell curve from our perspective, but that requires us to go ahead and plan accordingly and behave accordingly. And then finally, governments and legislation accelerating targets or heightening targets creates a flurry of activity, and that impacts our industry as we know. The next slide, thank you, James, helps us to think about change and compounding the challenges that we're in. We know that governments are injecting capital around the world. People need job creation and need to spend money, but also supply chain scrutiny has come to the fore. I think we'd all agree that we're looking at these long extended supply chains and asking ourselves, why are we here? Well, some of that is actually from low-cost country sourcing activities in the last 20 years, and it's exposed it, and we need to respond to it accordingly. And what we're seeing too is governments, as I said on the previous slide, thinking through ESG, an agenda item on every board, I would imagine today, an acronym less known 2 years ago, but a part of our DNA. It will become a part of every company's decision-making, and that includes us in the lowly fastener frame as well. And what it also means is that many of you on this call, or your customers, are in the process of examining supply chains and product design. So with electric vehicles in particular, fastener needs are changing. Materials get held together today that didn't get held together yesterday. Cleanliness is required for conductivity. Cable management, rather than fuel management, becomes a norm. And we still need to take weight out of vehicles. And those are challenges compounded by or complemented by the need for pace. I mentioned Tesla on this slide here, simply because the way they and new entrants come to the marketplace, they go faster than those with much larger infrastructures and histories, and people are running fast to keep up. Now, the next slide talks about our response. Firstly, for us at TR, we are investing in capacity. We always have been, but we're accelerating. We're also thinking about where we invest that capacity. We're also redeploying our capacity so we can constrict supply chains. And it's not just about cash flow. It's about that sort of visibility, transparency, and nimbleness that's needed. We want to acquire more capacity as a company, and that includes acquisitions in both manufacturing and distribution. We've got our own M&A team, which we're very grateful for. And this adverse environment does create opportunity. So from our perspective, we're willing and able and ready to make those acquisitions to place manufacturing capacity in the right place for the right reason. At the same time, our customers, and a number of you on this call are our customers, we want to engage earlier, and we want to accelerate agility through a thoughtful, pragmatic approach to engineering. Fasteners are weird and wonderful things. For those of you that have ever seen a line stop because of a fastener, it's very frustrating. And we'd like to try and remove bespoke, so pinch points in the supply chain become less prevalent, and that requires engagement. And it also requires the use of tools, digital tools. And so we are building, as we are on the call today, not in person, but we're utilizing technology more to enable to get better decisions made earlier, and rather than have to be in person. So we're building out a suite of tools that will allow engineers and designers and procurement teams to choose from the right part at the right time. And finally, non-stop transparent communication. In a challenged supply chain, there is a need to talk much more often. A QBR doesn't cut it. A quarterly business review is all very well and good, but what we are finding most effective at the moment is regular, consistent two-way communication with our suppliers and with our customers. Because in our world, fasteners are often thought about last. It's a lowly fastener, but it holds something together, and we care about it very much. And so that's just a little bit of a spotlight on the challenges. I know they're similar to many parts of the tier 1 and tier 2 into the automotive OEM marketplace, but we hope perhaps in the Q&A session afterwards and in the socializing event to compare notes. And that's my last slide. Thanks, James.
Thanks very much. Okay, let's now look at the supply chains and how they have been trying to manage those myriad difficulties I alluded to earlier, not least with COVID and Brexit. And delighted to have with us today Mary Goodrick, who is the VP for Business Development at DHL Supply Chain, who I would suggest has been at the coalface in a lot of these issues. So Murray, let me pass over to you.
Indeed. Thanks for that, Mike. Thanks for the opportunity this morning. So I'll just take the next probably 8 minutes or so just to walk you through a couple of thoughts from our side. The good news is there's a lot of common themes between what Mike and Dan have already talked about. So let's kick off with the first slide. If you can just flick on to the next one, please. So Dan summarised this perfectly. So it's been a perfect storm. Who could have predicted Brexit, COVID, Suez Canal, semiconductor? The kind of list goes on. And that perfect storm has been impacting all of us within the automobility supply chain, and I guess our ability to produce and also then innovate in the current market. So look, I think that's been covered really well this morning, so I won't dwell on that. I think if we can flick on to the next slide, let's really focus on where is that really taking us. And I think Frost and Sullivan have quoted this. As I said, every automotive manufacturer will have to reinvent themselves as a digital company in 2021. And I do truly believe that. And there's sort of 6 key areas that I'd just like to draw our attention to today. And we keep saying there's nothing like a disruption to drive innovation. So big one that we've seen is a massive rise in second life vehicles and the real move to e-commerce marketplaces. And that's completely changing that dynamic of that finished vehicle logistics market and the rise of second life vehicles, as opposed to just purely focusing on new manufactured vehicles. Second front one is really work from anywhere culture. It used to be a sort of work from home or work from a workplace, but work from anywhere is really driving a change and driving changes in buyer habits. So do people actually now need a vehicle in order to move to work, or actually do they need to look at a different type of buying option? And that really leads us into point 3 there, alternative consumer buying habits, driving an increase in subscription models, short-term, more agile models for either leasing or owning a vehicle. And we've started to brand that as lentil, and that can be somewhere between lease and rental. So anywhere between 1 to 5 months in terms of an ownership model for a vehicle, and that drives again a complete change in the way that market is serviced from a supply chain perspective. In terms of point 4, and sort of borrowed with pride from the SMMT here, is that real acceleration in digitalisation is becoming the norm, especially with social distancing and the restrictions that are continuing to be in place for at least the next few months. That's really driven an increase in accelerated digitalisation agenda and bringing more technology into the forefront of our manufacturing environments. The 5th one that we've got on there is the importance of supply chain resilience, and Dan made a really key call out to this in terms of tier 2 and tier 3 fasteners market. We are sort of categorising this more and more around connected supply chain. And when you see Thierry coming in from Jaguar Land Rover in one of the next forums, he very much talks about this sort of connected supply chain ethos and driving that transparency and resilience throughout the full connected end-to-end. Sustainability has always been huge in the automobility agenda, but I think it's even more so now, and it's accelerating a complete change in our market dynamics. So influencing customers to I guess change their buying behaviours and really focus on the importance of sustainability, as well as price, as well as other buying factors. And I think linking all of those things together, we've seen quite an influx of new market entrants. So we've seen Ineos coming into the market over the last 12 to 18 months. We've seen the rise of hydrogen as well, and an organisation you may be aware of in terms of Riversimple, really coming in and redefining that hydrogen electric propulsion systems. We've seen the rise of bikes as well. So you've seen TVRs and BSAs starting to come back into the forefront. So again, with disruption comes innovation. And I guess there's a key link to this as well around people. So we've seen a huge amount of resource migration into and out of the automobility sector over the last 12 to 18 months. And a lot of those automobility mindsets and ways of working now being implanted in other sectors, which is quite an interesting dynamic to work with. So I guess what does all that then mean? If we flick on to the next slide, please. I think that's really redefining the future of the automobility sector in the UK. So I've categorised this in 4 key areas. And the first one is the age of collaboration. I think no more than we've ever seen before, that need to collaborate and that willingness to collaborate is becoming really significant across T suppliers, OEMs, finished vehicle logistics and also aftermarket, and really driving true strategic partnerships where there's win-win-win scenario within there. That's really working with the Warwick Manufacturing Group and Coventry University on that industry and academia alignment, and specifically around digitalization, skill sets and training skills that are now required in a modern day working place. I think the second one is really challenging core competencies. We've seen a lot of organisations, especially through the last 12 to 18 months, really focus on what is our core competence, and is that something we want to continue making ourselves, or really driving? Is that something we want to outsource and we want to buy in? And with I guess challenges around taking 20-25% at least out of the overhead and core operating costs for organisations. We've seen a real shift towards an outsourcing model rather than a make within model. So again, just things to think about and market dynamics that are changing. The third one I think is heavily linked into that as well, and our organisations really fit for the future, and our you as organisations fit for the future, and heavily around people I think within here, and a real focus on productivity output, especially in the wake of Brexit, and really trying to drive that production output to really make sure that the UK stays on the global map and increases its market share globally. And then the final one, which again Dan touched on earlier on, is really that importance of supply chain resilience, and we also link this in heavily into cash flow. Never has been more important over the last 12 months is around really maximising cash flow for organisations, and with some organisations being able to maximise that cash flow has actually allowed them to survive during this pandemic period. So again, that real focus, stringent focus on cash flow has really come to the forefront. So just as a closing point for me, and we'll open up for Q&A shortly, but on the final slide, there's a nice quote here again, talking about, look, the automotive industry will be looking to 2021 and beyond to get right back on the road for growth. And I do personally believe there's a lot of opportunity now for growth. There's been a hell of a lot of disruption, but out of that has driven a lot of innovation. There's driven a need to think differently. There's driven a lot of organisations, including ourselves, to be much leaner from a central overhead perspective, and really diversifying where we see the opportunities for growth, whether that be in EV, whether that be in hydrogen propulsion, or whether that be alternative buying models for the end customer. So all of those things really are driving, I guess, an opportunity for us, I think, in 2021 and beyond, to really get back on track and make sure that the UK stays on that trajectory and driving an increase in market share across the wider globe. So that's just a quick sort of 8-10 minutes from myself. I'll be back a little bit later on for the Q&A session. But any questions, please put them in the chat as well. We're more than happy to follow up on them. Thank you. Thanks,
Murray. Okay, now one of the issues that Murray raised there, and we've touched on earlier, is about transition from internal combustion engines into electrified vehicles, whether they be hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and indeed full battery electric. That poses significant challenges for the supply chain. So I'm delighted we've got next to join us Dom Tribe, who's a director at Vendigital. Dom's got over 15 years experience in the automotive sector across procurement, supply chain, program management, but also in complementary sectors like aerospace and defense. And Vendigital have recently been working with a number of clients to support a transition to EV, and this is something that's before the entire global industry. So to give us a bit more insight into that transition, let me pass to Dom. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. And if we go to the next slide, please. Hello and good morning, everyone. Firstly, thank you for giving up your time this morning. I'd also like to extend my thanks to the team at the SMMT for this opportunity to speak about the transition to EVs and the challenges and opportunities. And Mike's previous quote that we just saw there was really poignant. And I'll do so with a sort of procurement and supply chain lens. If we go to the next slide, please. So the automotive ecosystem is a complex one. It's like a neural network and has many connections and interdependencies. The transition to EVs has sent huge shockwaves right across this ecosystem, meaning that the EV biased ecosystem of tomorrow will look drastically different to the one that we know of today. And each organizational function at each of those nodes is going to be disrupted, and in a big way. Technology, legislation, social responsibility, and as a consequence, consumer demand is applying pressure on OEMs, suppliers, research institutes, technology companies, and retailers to provide greener solutions to our mobility needs. And what we're seeing now is the emergence and restructuring of a whole new automotive ecosystem. This changing landscape has many new entrants to the market, so tech startups or unicorns, as they're sometimes referred to, as well as some of the established technology companies like Amazon and Google, are now looking to compete with established OEMs who are all fighting over market share in this new EV world. The legacy OEMs now, more than ever before, will have to think strategically about how they will deliver desirable and affordable vehicles quickly to market. The startups don't carry the same baggage as the legacy OEMs, and their agility is going to disrupt the sector. Partnerships and mergers are being announced almost weekly, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw greater consolidation in the market in the future. At the center of it all is the customer, and customers want quality products and value for money. Next slide, please, James. So Dan and Murray also mentioned the idea of a perfect storm earlier, and it's no different right now as we make the transition to electric vehicles. Firstly, there's increased demand for the same technologies and services, lithium batteries, semiconductors, electronics, and software, for example, compounded by an ever-increasing requirement for vehicles to be even more connected with their drivers and surroundings that requires ever-increasing amounts of data to be collected, analysed, and executed flawlessly. And the change in consumers' buying behaviour and ownership models. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see just how connected consumers want to be, both in terms of their data sharing, but also with the act of driving itself. So what does this all mean for those of us in particular in procurement and supply chain who are left with sorting out this significant part of the unprecedented change? Next slide, please. Well, it means challenges, and a lot of them, but also a very real opportunity to bring procurement and supply chain to the very forefront of this paradigm shift. As you can see from the diagram on the left, there are plenty of new components and systems that are going to need designing, engineering, manufacturing, sourcing. All of these have opportunities to become cost optimal. And aside from safety, which has to be the number one consideration in all of this, there are some key areas to focus on. Firstly, cost. So reports suggest EV price parity with their combustion engine counterpart will be achieved by 2025 to 2027. And obviously lithium batteries are a large contributor to the BOM cost. But as technology advances, this is predicted to come down significantly. I'm more interested in the opportunities beyond parity and the obvious items like battery cells. I think there's a very real opportunity to make EVs hugely competitive, and it starts with cost-optimized designs. Talking of designs, there are lots of new and changing technologies. As I said before, batteries will get better, so the focus will shift to other areas of the vehicle to take cost out. And this is where there's a very real opportunity to apply great value analysis, value engineering, should cost modeling, and design for manufacturing methodologies. There's also a challenge and opportunity in vertical integration that Murray picked up on. Which designs and IP should be kept in-house versus outsourced? Volkswagen recently announced their intention to bring semiconductors in-house to make them customized to their own requirements, as well as to ensure continuity of supply. In the diagram, I've highlighted the thermal management system, or Octovalve, that was designed by Tesla, a solution that elegantly met Tesla's specific thermal management needs versus a conventional system that would have meant multiple components and greater complexity. But designing their own system in-house, Tesla have removed significant cost, weight, and complexity. And this is where design solutions can be radically advantageous. So it's vitally important to include procurement and cost and engineering right from the start of the design journey. And then there's the supply chain and sourcing elements. So reliance on countries like China for rare earth materials, where 80% of lithium comes from, Democratic Republic of Congo for cobalt, for example. These represent risks, whether it's political instability, complex supply chains, monopolized supply, changing tariffs, etc. There's an opportunity to look at how we can domesticate large parts of the supply chain to mitigate these risks, whilst also being in keeping with the decarbonisation agenda. Another challenge is how your procurement and supply chain functions are structured and organised, as well as the skills that you have in-house. We need to consider systems rather than components and their interconnections across the vehicle. The procurement and supply chain functions need to be market-facing in that regard, and so it's a great opportunity for suppliers to ensure their offerings align with that. Creating the right skills in-house will also bring about more IP creation. We've recently seen and experienced huge shifts in demand and pricing volatility. We've all heard about semiconductors. There are over 3 times more electronics in a battery electric vehicle than its combustion engine counterpart, and it shows no signs of slowing down. There's also huge volatility in pricing against some of the raw materials. So for example, neodymium used in rare earth magnets has seen a 50% increase throughout 2020. So forecasting and contractual material escalators are absolutely vital. And then there's the manufacturing methods themselves. So the idea of a microfactory isn't anything new, but there's a real opportunity to rethink and reestablish what supply chains and factories of the future can look like in order to minimize the CapEx investment and to create agility. And in addition, those suppliers perhaps who are predominantly working within combustion engines and drivetrains may want to think about diversifying using complementary manufacturing methods. So for example, a stamping and laser cutting supplier, maybe making head gaskets, for example, could be diversified into stampings for back irons, as you can see from the small diagram by the motor. What we absolutely cannot do, though, is apply old ways of thinking to electric vehicles. Otherwise, we are only going to get suboptimal outcomes. Next slide, please, James. So there are obviously a lot of things we as procurement and supply chain professionals and the wider organisations can be doing to create strategic value. Namely, but not exhaustively, using data to gain better visibility into the supply chains and enable better forecasting and allocation. Secondly, manufacturers and suppliers should be looking at their product offerings versus the adoption roadmaps by country, region and customers and pivoting where possible to meet the new EV-related demands. We also want to start looking at that vertical integration, the make versus buy, and to mitigate issues with supply, but also IP ownership and create bespoke products that meet your needs. There's also real value in building strategic relationships and partnerships with critical suppliers. This isn't anything new, but should be built upon, and so good SRM will really reap the rewards. Should also, as mentioned before, take a systems integrated approach and ensure that that is market facing. The same applies to the organizational structure and the skill set that you have within house. And using the best procurement and supply chain methodologies is going to reap the rewards. So building cost models, commodity strategies for the new technologies and components, and thinking about all of those interdependencies. And then going on to create a map of those interdependencies. So cost against performance, looking at sequential and parallel opportunities as well. So if you take something like a motor, the magnets versus the copper windings versus the current from the power inverter, how do you play these off one another to optimize the performance against the cost? And lastly, but by no means least, ensuring compliance to a lot of the alliances. There are new alliances being set up for batteries and responsible minerals as well. So, like I said before, this is just really a sample of actions that individuals, suppliers, organizations can take away. And in closing, I just want to finish with, the cost of EVs is set to fall. By how much, no one can really guess. There's a lot of speculation. Some reports suggest by up to a third. But what is really clear is that procurement and supply chain professionals, we need to understand what those cost drivers are and then capitalize and exploit those to make EVs value for money. And so it's absolutely critical for suppliers and customers to work in close collaboration with one another. But that shouldn't be anything new. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tom. A lot of food for thought there. And if you've got questions, as I said from the start, do put them into the question box and we'll come to them actually after our next speaker. Who is? It's about time I think we heard from an OEM and what they're seeing from the recent turbulence in the industry arising from COVID, Brexit, and these other challenges. So delighted to welcome Mick Aiers, whose background is extensively in purchasing, and he's the one whose business card keeps changing every few years from GM to PSA, and now Stellantis. So, Mick, over to you.
So hopefully, thanks for the introduction. Next slide, please. And the next one. So first of all, apologies, I don't have as many pretty pictures as my previous presenters, only my photo there that I think was last seen on Crime Watch, because I'm wearing a shirt and tie. Imagine those days, or remember those days. Now, most of my work is outside of the UK. So I've got some insight onto what's going on in the UK, but particularly to contrast that with Europe and elsewhere. I'm not presenting this on behalf of Stellantis, but as the chair of the Automotive Council Supply Chain Finance and Sustainability Group. For those that don't know who Stellantis are, you will know Vauxhall in the UK, Opel, Peugeot, Citroën, DS, also includes all of the Fiat brands, Chrysler brands, Maserati as well. I've been in this industry more years than I care to remember, and I've been through many crises. However, what I would say is the challenge in front of us now is the most significant I have seen. Next slide, please. Now, whether you were for or against Brexit, we now have some clarity. Now, we came back after Christmas thinking that a post-Brexit life would be easier after years and years of debate and uncertainty. However, that debate was masking some fundamental changes in the industry. The post-Brexit environment is making it a little more difficult, putting it politely, to import and export, and the lead times associated with that. As was already mentioned, the change of consumer behavior, not just in automotive, but generally as we're getting used to buying more things online, makes volumes very difficult to predict. And the shortages of key components, microprocessors, steel, plastic grades, etc., etc. Now, it's an interesting thought that the industry is suggesting that the loss of volume relating to shortages of key components is going to be greater than that we lost through COVID. Now, it's clear that the UK has put its line in the sand with regards to the internal combustion engine. So by 2030, the UK is going to ban the pure combustion engine vehicles. The cost of that transition is massive, and the cost of not doing it is massive, and they're both measured in billions. The fines for not meeting the CO2 targets will be significant. Now, what's happened through COVID, the industries have been given a lot of liquidity through government support. That's not just in the UK, but it's true of other countries. But I'm concerned about balance sheets, and that with a heavily loaded balance sheet, the appetite of lenders will change. There's some debate about what's going to happen with interest rates. We have grown up in the last 10 or 12 years, and some CFOs have not experienced anything other than marginal interest rates. That will change. Some are speculating that they will go negative. Some are speculating that they may rise significantly. We've also mentioned new players in the market with Apple and Amazon, etc. And we will also have associated new suppliers. So we're going to get consolidation at every level. Now, whether you will be a winner or a loser will depend on your planning. But the speed of change here is unprecedented. And this is why I'm saying that I wouldn't necessarily call it a crisis, but we have to be in a crisis mode to keep up with the change that we're expecting. And if companies have not started planning now, events will overtake them. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to labor on this chart, but what I would say is that if you look at the first stage of 2024, 45% of the vehicle, EV and BHEV, will need to be originated from the UK or Europe. And you can see it's 60% of the battery pack. And that ramps up into 2027. So I'm not going to go through this. You should familiarize yourself with this if you have not already. Now, my personal ambition is for the UK to embed as much of this into the UK to avoid being dependent on Europe and importing all of these key components from Europe. In terms of automotive, 2024 and indeed 2027 is tomorrow. If you haven't started planning, you're already behind. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, the UK's ambition is to ban the sale of pure internal combustion engine vehicles by 2030. If you're a company dependent on internal combustion engines, your transition plans should have started. And I'm going to mention in a moment, if you haven't already started those plans, or if indeed you need to engage with your customers, we have come up with a process to do so. Next slide. Now, you will recall in my introduction that I said that I have experience across different jurisdictions. Now, in the US, coordination between the vehicle manufacturers, OEMs, is commonplace, whether that's in or outside of an insolvency. In Europe, insolvency is coordinated through insolvency practitioners. You will know them as administrators, but there are some differences. In Germany, there are well-established customer groups that come together if a supplier goes into some form of insolvency. In France, the market is dominated by PSA and Renault, PSA being part of the Stellantis group. And there is significant political pressure at local level, which will be the mayor, up to government level, to keep that business in the UK. Italy is dominated by Fiat, and again, there is political pressure to keep business in Italy in that case. In Spain, many of the customers originate from Germany, so therefore the German customer groups apply. In the UK, however, every stakeholder that's involved with a supplier that's in distress will protect their position first and foremost. And OEM groups are not that well established in the UK. It's really done on a case-by-case basis. Often, not always, but often the OEMs embark on resourcing outside of the UK to their preferred trusted suppliers. And that capability is permanently lost. Now, typically the distress is signaled to their customer, the OEM, at a very late stage. And the distress is so severe, the options are limited. So early notification is not incentivized in our environment. Now, Brexit is limiting exit strategies here. There has been a lot of Chinese activity, but the political environment between the UK, the rest of the world, China, may mean that that investment may not be as forthcoming. And Brexit is also limiting strategies where there is an additional hurdle for foreign direct investment into the UK. Next slide, please. So the beginning of 2020, if we can remember back that far, gave no indication really of the dramatic time ahead. Volumes were robust, Brexit planning was underway, no significant insolvencies, but there were those headwinds that I have mentioned, very capital intensive. And we know in March, the world changed. We had 3 months of little or no production in automotive. Government support through furlough, government support through C-bills, bounce back loans was impressive, I have to say. The government have had their critics, but without that, we would have been in a very different place. And the moratorium on the necessity for directors to file for insolvency is helpful, but there are some what is termed by the press and the industry as zombie companies out there. It's not just existent in the UK, but elsewhere. Now, when we came out of the first lockdown in the summer of last year, pent-up demand drove initial volumes. A lot of households had spare cash because they weren't spending it going to work, etc. Now, a lot of society, when we had that first unlocking, assumed that the worst is over, and I hope we don't repeat that, because coming out or getting out of this lockdown, we need to do it carefully so we don't go back in. And I wonder if memories are too short, because if you look globally, the number of cases are at a record high. Next slide, please. So we are seeing more issues appearing in 2021. What happened with COVID is that it's accelerated the shift from the internal combustion engine. And it accelerated that capital need for us and the suppliers. Now, believe it or not, we are already halfway through the year. It is 2 weeks until the longest day. I find it a little difficult to believe where this year has gone. Penalties for not meeting CO2 will be very severe, and some suppliers will be left behind if they are not prepared or have not already transitioned their business. And there's going to be consolidation at every level. As was already mentioned, you can imagine some of the OEMs consolidating, and that's going to flow through to suppliers. The debt loading, because of the COVID loans that have been provided, not just in the UK, but across Europe, has meant that balance sheets are not sustainable. And there's a question about private equity. How active is private equity going to become? And there's a question also about the role of the Chinese in a post-Brexit environment. Will they be as enthusiastic to invest in the UK? So I've mentioned about low interest rates. We don't know where they are going to go, but they're always going to be winners and losers in this, and it depends on your planning. Shortages of key components, there's some speculation when that is going to end. Some are speculating that that will end in the fourth quarter. Some are speculating that it will leach over into next year. And we'll have to wait and see when that is going to be. Another factor is pricing of key components, whether that's steel, copper, is going up and up. Also, let's not forget, as I mentioned earlier, we are having the highest number of cases at the moment, and India's cases are stabilizing, but that's still a crisis. So next slide, please. The industry, that's us, need to grasp this nettle. We cannot rely on outside sources to resolve our issues. There's going to be no white knight. The world is going to be different. We need to act differently. But what I would say is, through the Automotive Council and all of the people on this call, we have a wealth of experience. We can't solve all supplier issues, but we can endeavor to use our collective experience. Now, what I'm going to describe is a safe harbor process. And I would ask that if you feel that it's going to be useful, you nominate yourself. But in doing so, that is not going to result in punitive actions. Acting collectively will protect UK manufacturing as best we can. And whilst I've worked around the world, I am passionate about UK manufacturing. And we've got to follow certain boundaries, but we have Competition and Market Authority approval to use this safe harbour process. And thanks to the SMMT to facilitate that. So the following is our proposal to preserve as much as we can. Next slide, please. Now, the safe harbour process allows suppliers or a supplier to come together with its customers under a third party, and you can see there in that box the third parties that have signed up. We're always looking for other third parties because the rates of some of these consultants are going to be at the top end of the market. So where there is a smaller consultant, then we're happy to engage with them. This concept of safe harbor came up through the 2008 financial crash, but the competition lawyers had a heart attack at the time. But with COVID, we've managed to get the sanction of the Competition and Markets authorities. And what it allows suppliers to do, or companies to do, is to come together in a controlled environment together with customers to think about your business plans, to think about what needs to happen with a supplier's company to get it transitioned to face all the challenges that I've mentioned. So if you feel that you could facilitate yourself of this, you can see the email address on the screen there, safeharbor@SMMT. Nominate yourself. It's not going to result in any punitive action. The first engagement will be through the SMMT to see whether it's going to be appropriate. It's sanctioned through the Automotive Council. It is sanctioned by the Competition and Markets Authority. And I am sure that there are some suppliers out there that would benefit from this process. Because we're running out of time, I'm not going to labor on the next slide, but there is a very clear process that is described there that will describe how this will function and the key steps. So with that, I'm going to end. I'm sure there are lots of questions, or at least I hope there are lots of questions for me and the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Mick. Yes, we've got some questions coming in, and as I said, just if you have further questions, just put them into the question box and I will try address them to the speakers. A couple of questions to start with. First of all, the couple that's coming, which I'll probably just need to touch on briefly. One is what's the situation with Liberty Steel and the issues around the steel issues, including pricing. Obviously, we are not privy to discussions that are going on between Liberty, the government, and other parties. We hope a solution can be found. I think we've all read a lot about it in the Sunday papers and so forth, and I'm not going to comment on that. But we would hope a solution could be found, because obviously there is a dependence on that supply, and there's a dependence on that company, but there's also a lot of livelihoods at stake. So we hope a solution can be found. More globally, what we are seeing is steel price doubling in the last 6 months or so, which is putting huge pressure on cost. And on top of that, there is a review of by DIT on steel safeguards. So again, we're engaged in that review, trying to ensure that the UK can retain its competitiveness, and indeed the broader supply chain can do as well. But obviously these, again, much like Mick has pointed to, there's a lot of competition compliance issues around these sort of discussions. So we are either very mindful of that if we're involved, or are careful not to be involved because it would be inappropriate for us to do so. Another question relating to one of my earlier presentations on why we have hybrids listed on that chart with BEVs and plug-ins rather than mild hybrids, given they both effectively are powered by, to the greater extent, by fossil fuel-based internal combustion engines. The answer is partly for historical reasons. These were generally described as alternatively fueled vehicles, but also more relevantly with what the government has announced in terms of the phase out of internal combustion engines, conventional from 2030, vehicles that can drive a considerable distance with zero emission tailpipe emissions, which was obviously be BEVs. It will be plug-in hybrids, and it will be a degree of hybrids as well. We are awaiting a government consultation on that. It was promised in the spring. we're getting for the spring in government terms, it's normally by Wimbledon, but don't put your mortgage on it. Our indications are that it's still not ready for publication. I'm not sure whether they've done the cabinet right round yet, but certainly that will, we will certainly be, as everyone will be entitled to inputting into that to determine what technologies are permissible between 2030 and 2035. Okay, another couple of questions I've got for the panelists. Firstly to Dan, you talked about what you're seeing in the last 12 months or so. Maybe thinking the next 12 months or so, which markets or parts of the automotive sector do you expect to see the most growth in the next few years, and perhaps why?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Well, I think it's an obvious statement to talk about percentage growth in these developing technologies. I can't comment on a ceiling of global vehicles produced per year, so I won't attempt to do that. It's not my forte. But what we are seeing across our customer base is a rapidity in the need to pressure test newer technologies of how things are lightweighted or held together, or managing the electrification process in particular. Geographically, we would say we're seeing it follow GDP. So in that sense, the earlier adopters, or frankly, past early adoption, but the broader adoption of technology is in the more developed regions, first and foremost, but with almost every government in the world of significance committing to something that reduces emissions and cleans the air. And so we don't see many parts of society that don't travel down this road. The pace is different. But if you look at a Joe Biden government in the US, promises made in political campaigns have to make themselves manifest. And so we see that. And ditto here in Europe, really. G7 leaders are all meeting, amongst many things, no doubt, will be how to beat Paris agreements and go to the next step. So we're seeing it a lot in that electrification. And what does that mean? A whole range of acronyms, as you've just described. And fast. The challenge that we see most is pace, and Mick talked about pace, new entrants, and we see people scrambling, large companies scrambling. And when a large company scrambles, it can get noisy. And so we're watching that with interest and partaking, obviously, with real vigor.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think what we do know is, if you look across Europe, there's an enormous EU COVID recovery fund. And I think 25% of that COVID recovery fund is earmarked for green projects. And a lot of member states, those that have automotive industries, are sort of saying, well, we're going to dedicate some of that money either to batteries or the transition across the supply chain, or indeed infrastructure to accelerate that transition. And the sums involved are pretty eye-watering. So I would endorse that view. If I can turn to Murray. What you've described is, in many ways, a sort of a perfect storm over the last sort of 18 months or so. But picking out one in particular, and it's the one we've all been wrestling with over the last 5 years, and that's Brexit. To what extent, Murray, do you think the Brexit's impacting the UK's ability to manage its supply chains during this time?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, to be honest, Mike. I think there's a huge spectrum within that question as well, ranging from, I've seen some organisations have had fairly limited impact actually through Brexit, through to complete sort of significant disruption. I think Dan mentioned earlier on about sort of increase in costs for their inputs. I think it's been compounded by COVID and semiconductor shortages, etc. All of that is then sort of masking, I think, the true impact of Brexit, good or bad. I think just linking back in with your point a few moments ago, I think there are some real positives coming out of it. I think that investment from government, you mentioned about injecting capital into the development of battery technology specifically, and really making the UK at the forefront of battery technology, and also the drive for infrastructure investment in the UK as well, to drive that grid solutions and the the charging infrastructure required for that. So I think that is a positive that's coming out either directly or indirectly off the back of Brexit. We've had to drive a lot of innovation actually as a result of Brexit, especially around streamlining the digital customs processes. So we've specifically done that for a lot of retailers actually in the Irish market, and we're trying to drive that out on a much wider scale as well to other sectors, and ultimately that holy grail of the movement between France and UK and sort of reverse flows. And the final one, I think, as well, around finished vehicles is really quite key. So we witnessed quite a number of OEMs really taking advantage of the favourable tariff codes, and specifically around importing and exporting vehicles for the UK. And a good example of importing a vehicle in a more basic form to get obviously the benefits of that tax relief, and then ultimately upscaling those within the UK market for onward distribution then and sale. So I think a real mixed bag is the honest answer. I wish I had a real concise answer to it, but yeah, if somebody can provide that, then I think you'd be a smarter man than I am.
Well, there's a lot of people wrestling with that, and I've never heard a concise answer to it. So you'd be doing well if you did, but it's still interesting. Dom, if I can turn to you, perhaps, and what we touched upon there is, and others is, among these challenges is the shift towards electrification. Now, obviously, the UK's got amongst the most challenging targets, which demonstrates the ambition the government has to be certainly a market which is EV. But obviously, we want to ensure we make the vehicles, the components here. Are there any particular components, sub-assemblies you think the UK is best suited to, where they may have an existing advantage, or indeed is there, where is the opportunity for those supply chain companies looking to transition into the right sort of technology that will be in high demand in the next few years?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, in the UK, we're very lucky. We have a brilliant and capable and very diverse supply chain. Obviously, battery cell manufacturing is some way off in the UK, but there's lots of sort of peripheral ancillary complementary elements to battery cell manufacturing. So there's the casings. There's also things like anode and cathode manufacturing as well. But also, if you're a fabricator, metal worker in the UK, for example, these batteries needs housings, casings to be housed and used. But also things like if you're a transmission casting company, things like rotors and stators and motors, for example, need to be high pressure cast or low pressure cast, for example. So there's a lot of sort of complementary diversification that a lot of our suppliers and known capable suppliers in the UK are able to do. And there's also the idea of this skateboard chassis that a lot of electric vehicles are based upon. And so again, there's a lot of capability in the UK because these are big, large, heavy items you don't really want to be shipping around the world. And so things like roll-formed aluminium and steel and things like that are one such area that I think has a really good opportunity in the UK. And actually, I know we talk a lot about manufacturing, and that's obviously one part of it. But if you sort of think of it earlier on in the supply chain, we have a really great R&D capability in the UK as well that feeds into that manufacturing base. And that shouldn't be underestimated either, because there's a huge amount of value that can be added to that. And I mentioned before in my presentation around sort of the back iron, if you look at a lot of motors, particularly in some of the more forward-thinking cars like Tesla, who've kind of got to the market quite quickly, they've been done reasonably well, but there's still a lot of opportunity to improve on the design. They were built with a job in mind and to get the job done, and not necessarily a cost optimal position. So particularly on the back iron, for example, there's huge amounts of opportunity there to think about the design and how you remove scrap and how you become, almost sort of class leading. And there's no reason why the UK couldn't be class leading in something like that.
Interesting. I've got questions coming for Mick, and Mick's going to have to get his crystal ball out. Obviously, there is a possibility that combination of higher prices, doubts about EVs, doubts about investment in infrastructure, could result in consumers effectively sitting on their hands, not buying new products. This combination of issues. Do you have any feel as we get towards 2030? I'll ask Mick first, and then maybe anyone else who wants to come in, about where you think the total market might be, because it is germane to production, obviously. Do you think it's going to be a sort of linear change? Where do you think that the total volumes will go when you get around about, towards 2030?
Thanks for setting that up for me, Mike. That's really helpful. Not a clue, honestly. One thing that's not been touched upon is we've talked about consumer behavior because of the internet and people getting used to buying more online. Mm-hmm. There is a drive towards the commoditization of the cars and vans, for that matter. And you've seen some new entrants into the market like Kazoo and Cinch, etc. But one thing that we've not touched on is behavior of generations that are buying their first vehicle. Indeed, there's a question whether they will ever buy their first vehicle. When I was growing up, it was a rite of passage at the age of 17. If you passed your driving test, you went out and bought a car, typically second hand. That motivation doesn't seem to exist in the generation that's going to be buying cars. So it's highly likely that we're going to move away from a buying model to a leasing on a more short-term basis than even we have today. And it's going to be interesting to see how that drives volumes and where the vehicle park is going to be by 2030. So I don't have a crystal ball. There are so many variables that it's pretty much impossible to even contemplate looking into that ball.
Yeah, I think it's really a question of turning the question on its head, and that's what we're trying to do. What do we need to sustain a strong market and sustain a strong manufacturing base to support that market in the UK? Because for all the factors that are highlighted there and additional ones that you touch, there are a number of different factors coming to play, but we need a strong market, we need a strong manufacturing sector in order to sustain jobs and to sustain the affordability of the product that we produce. So I'm certainly, one of the things that we're very much focused on is ensuring the UK is currently the second largest new car market in the UK, in Europe, and remains at least second place, because a strong market obviously helps investment. Okay, I've got a final question, which I'd like just 5 seconds from everyone. And that's just really a view on the effect of COVID on UK supply chains. Do we think that, I should say the effect of COVID as well as CO2 on supply chains, do we think the UK supply chain can and will grow as a result of these changes? Or do you think the jury's still out as to whether those factors will help or hinder the UK? Murray, I'll go to you first, because you're just purely because you're first on the image I've got on my screen.
No, it's a great question. I think we have to reshape to make sure that we are fit for the future. I keep using that phrase of fit for the future. Seeing some recent reports from Roland Berger talking about glocalization, so more either local production or local inventory holding closer to the point of end use. All of that for me provides opportunity then for the UK to prosper following COVID and following all the various different impacts of Brexit. So I think it's for us to drive in all honesty, and we've got to be in charge of our own destiny.
Dom, do you agree?
Yeah, I do, and I think there's some really, really good points Murray's picked up on there. I think, for me at least, I think there's a great sort of learning from COVID and how you can operate with fewer people and under different circumstances. There's been sort of reduced capacity at factories. There have been retailers having to sell vehicles remotely and that sort of thing, and it's really forced people into an environment in which perhaps maybe they were thinking about and thought about maybe there's some opportunities there to reshape their business, but it's really has forced them into reshaping and Murray says fit for the future, and I think there's a lot of learning and a lot of opportunities that have come from it, and so I think we'll see more and more virtual selling. We'll see more and more different sort of ways of manufacturing and different capacity models as well throughout the manufacturing supply chain.
Dan, are you equally optimistic?
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to go with yes, we can, but you went with can and will, or can or will. We certainly can, but it's a huge amount of work. Mick rightly predicts lots of challenges ahead. But eyes wide open, I believe we will. But it does require government support. It requires working together. It requires transparency, honesty, and effort.
Yeah. And Mick, I'll leave the last few to you.
It can, but one of the things that COVID has done has made us potentially less communicative. Knowing what your customer is doing, what their plans are, is essential. Do not think the market is going to come knocking on your door. As a UK supplier, we're now very much an island with the Brexit situation. You as a supplier have to know exactly what your customer is doing. You need to push that. Do not think it's going to come your way. You have to create it.
Thanks, sage advice. Okay, we've run out of time, but we do have a networking session next, for which you need to click on the networking tab on the microsite that should be before you. And then you'll be helped through that process. But just remains for me to thank all our speakers today, to Dan, to Dom, to Murray, and to Mick, to thank you for joining. I hope you will now participate in the networking session. Any questions, do pass them to SMMT and the team. I think what you heard from all of our speakers there at the end is a degree of optimism about the future. Short term, there are still immense challenges, and going into the medium term, but the inherent strengths that the UK have is what we need to build on. Certainly the SMMT, we're trying to encourage government to give us the right support, and we're trying to provide what support we can direct to businesses. So if we can do more of that, do get in touch. But in the meantime, enjoy the networking session. I hope it produces some valuable connections, as I'm sure it will. Thank you very much. And if we don't see you beforehand, as I said before, we have our summit on the 29th of June, and then in October, a Meet the Buyer for those who wish to participate in that. But as ever, thank you for your time this morning, and I hope to see you in person sooner rather than later. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.